Welcome to All Things Geekery, the podcast dedicated to exploring the vast world of geeky hobbies and discussing all the random topics in between. I'm your host, Iogro, and welcome to the show. What's going on, guys? Thank you so much for joining in on today's podcast, episode number 5. Today, we're going to be talking about the very first episode in our Sword and Sorcery series, Krull. If you guys have not seen this movie, I highly recommend it. You guys have got to go check this thing out. I'm sure most of you that are born in the 80s or were from the 80s or have seen any of the 80s movies, you guys have already checked this film out. It is one of the greatest sword and sorcery fantasy movies of all time. It is one of my top 3 films from the genre, and it was very hard to make this and for me to remain objective about the film because I enjoyed it so much as a kid. There were so many things from my childhood that I remember about this movie, and just recently, I've watched the film again, and I have noticed so many things that this movie really brought into it from the 80s genre. It borrows freely from Tolkien and Greek and Arthurian mythology, and of course, it's very heavily based around Star Wars as well. Now, it's not a knockoff film, if that's what you're thinking, but even with all the borrowing of themes for this 80s science fiction, fantasy, cult clash mix-up, it was hard for me not to have some genuine affection towards this movie. Seeing this film in the 80s as a young boy, it just really sparked a huge, intense drive that I already had for this kind of wild imagination and fantasy realm. I loved science fiction, I loved fantasy, writing, all of that kind of stuff back when I was a kid. And it has carried over into my adult years, and that's why my co-host Victus and I get along so well, because we are just big geeks. We really are. We love everything about, and that's why one reason we made this podcast is to explore everything out there. So if you're thinking about checking Krull out, don't look at it from a standpoint of this is just going to be a really bad film because it was made in the 80s and it had a cheap budget and it pulled from all these other big genre movies. No, it was a very well-made film and far from a cheaply made knockoff by any means. So check it out, see what you guys think, and continue listening because we're going to review some of the major plot points. But if you haven't seen it, you might want to stop listening now because there's probably going to be some spoilers in there for you. What's notable about Krull is the genre mixing as it draws from the fantasy sci-fi films mentioned before with all the swords, castles, epic battles, and beasts and monsters. But it, for the time period, had some great laser and lighting effects. You think about the 80s films that we got to see in the science fiction, fantasy, sword and sorcery area. There's a lot of really bad films out there. But from start to finish, this film brings us an epic adventure of good versus evil, and it was never a dull moment to watch. Krull opens with what seems to be a gigantic ship traveling through the dark, vast expanse of space. But what we really find out is this ship is called the Black Fortress. This ship is in fact a massive stronghold for the Beast and his army of slayers. Now the Beast is, of course, it is a monster that is looking to take over worlds, and the Slayers are these ghastly-looking creatures that make up his army. So this ship touches down on a planet named Krull, which opens the major portion of this story, and it really sets the plot for a battle of good versus evil like most of the great fantasy films of this day. We have a hero of the story. He was a prince named Colwyn, who is about to wed a fellow kingdom's daughter. Her name was Princess Lissa. And during this wedding, the Beast sends his slayers to attack the castle where the wedding ceremony was being held to take the princess and bring her back to the Beast in the Black Fortress. Soon after the battle of the wedding and the Beast taking the princess, there was a wise man named Hugh Near who had actually come down from the mountains, and he had traveled to find Prince Colwyn, and together, these two, they head off to rescue the princess from the clutches of this evil beast. So again, we're setting the story for a very epic proportion, and it's just going to blow up from here. So along the way, Colwyn and Hugh Near, they amass a kind of a ragtag band of allies to help with their quest. This band of allies is a group made up of wizards, thieves, a cyclops. So this wizard that they find, his name is Ergo the Magnificent. And this guy can't even get a spell right. He can't get one to save his life. In fact, the spell that he does try very first off in the movie, he's so bad at being a wizard, he turns himself into a creature, a goose. So there is some comedy, there's some relief in this movie. It's not all seriousness, and it's not all 80s gore. A lot of those 80s science fiction, fantasy, sword and sorcery movies had a lot of gore based in them. This one doesn't. This one is just a good old-fashioned epic story to be told. So along with this Ergo the Magnificent wizard, who can't get his spells right, you also had Bernard Bresslaw, who played a Cyclops. Now, the Cyclops in the film, he is kind of a protagonist, to say. He doesn't say a lot in the film, but he's also one of the major characters and plays a very big role throughout the story. If you guys have not seen the movie, just watch. You'll see what happens. And then, of course, there's this band of outlaws and thieves that they stumble upon. And amongst that group is Liam Neeson in a very brief stint in this movie. He had done a couple of films before this one, but never anything major. These first 3 films that he did were kind of a starting spot for him. He didn't make stardom until much later in his career. So ultimately, Krull is a film that it really shines and comes to life in an individual scene and kind of throughout the movie rather than as a whole, if you look at it. Really, this film was full of captivating designs and special effects. Colwyn had a weapon in this film called the glaive, and it is, for the most part, one of the most epic weapons in the sword and sorcery film era of all time. The way Colwyn had to go get this weapon was retrieving it from a pool of lava. So there's a lot of mysteries surrounding this weapon. They don't really explain a lot of what happens to it, but when you see it, you'll understand kind of what we're talking about. So the Slayers, we talked about them just a little bit ago. They are one of the best parts of this film. They are a silent creature. They don't really say or make a lot of noises other than this horrific scream they emit when killed. And that makes them kind of a very intimidating film foe. They are grotesque in nature. They have this suit of armor that looks very ominous, but inside is something that is a creature, and they don't really explain a lot about where they came from or what they really are. You just have to see them to understand kind of what they're there for. They have spears, and the spears are believable at one point that it's a cool weapon. These spears shoot lasers. So there's some cheesiness mixed in with this film as well. But ultimately, this Slayer creature is one of the coolest bad guys in a movie ever. One of the coolest things I remember about Krull from my childhood was how scary it seemed to be. There were really great tense moments, and there is a scene in the movie about a giant spider and a very creepy sequence in a swamp where a seer is taken over by a shape-shifting clone with black eyes. And I remember as a kid it was frightening, and it honestly gave me nightmares. But I think that was some of the draw to this movie for me, is how everything pulled together to, like I said, these scenes made up of little bits and tidbits here and there that kind of pulled this story together. The other thing that made this movie so tense and so intriguing was the set designs that the people brought in. The entire movie was littered with amazing set designs. The Black Fortress was full of them. It had everything from moving floors, and it had that mainstay of action fantasy, and it had those walls that sprout spikes to kill people. Out of this entire movie, From start to finish, the finish of the film was fantastic. And that's really where Krull's concluding act as Colwyn, the soon-to-be king, and his loyal band fight their way through this Black Fortress, that it becomes most exciting, with the 70s and 80s being the grand era of science fiction and fantasy themes. Krull was no stranger to this theme, and it had some fantastic photography. It had set locations to bring all of this fantasy to a very fond place in our hearts. So if you guys have not seen this movie, go check it out. See what you think. I'd love to know what your comments are, what your favorite part of the film was, and who your favorite actor in the film is. Thanks for stopping by and listening today, guys. We really appreciate your support. Drop us a like, give us a comment, and let us know how we're doing. Stop by and check us out on our website at www.allthingsgeekery.com. You can also find us on our YouTube and Twitter. Just look up All Things Geekery. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll see you in the next episode.